I'm going to tell you the story of a grand revolt. In 19th century France, art and politics had become enmeshed, and just as a French coup d'etat could have far-reaching effects, the Impressionist movement changed the course of art in ways that are still being felt. In a museum, don't you skip over the centuries of boring, overbearing, and dingy paintings that were produced by luminaries of the times who are unheard of today. And when you come to the Impressionist room, don't you feel refreshed and uplifted? It's as if a window was opened to let the light and air in. I think art evolves. Artists record their times, the fashions, intrigues, morals, and ideals. The teacher gives his ideas, techniques, and inspiration to his students. And they will build something new, sometimes better, but often worse. As an artist ages, their preoccupation changes. New materials and colors become available. They meet new friends who influence his style, and as fashions change, so does their art. I consider myself a fourth-generation Impressionist, so I have very close ties to this gang of renegades. What they started swept the world. But the story I'm going to tell starts at the beginning of the 19th century, with two amazing and influential painters who taught and influenced thousands of artists who in turn taught and influenced the Impressionists. Ingres and David were neoclassicists. Both led fascinating lives and painted astounding paintings, often breaking with the neoclassical tradition of precision and reason. You had to paint historical or mythological subjects, portraits of nobility, or biblical themes. You needed to excel in anatomy because most of your subjects would be naked, but you also needed to be able to paint luscious drapery that delicately covered parts of those bodies. Your paintings would feature chiaroscuro, which was a technique of lighting that exaggerated the shadows and lights. Novelty, improvisation, self-expression, and blinding inspiration were not neoclassical virtues. Ingres began his studies with David, but eventually found fame for himself and won prestigious awards at the Salon. He was capable of painting any subject matter, but it was his portraits that we remember. Ingres assumed the role of guardian of academic orthodoxy against the coming Romantics. He taught many artists who became the idols of the next generation. He spent many years traveling in Italy. Unlike David, Ingres seemed to stay away from political battles. David became an active supporter of the French Revolution. He was a friend of Robespierre, and as a result was the dictator of the arts under the French Republic. Imprisoned after Robespierre's fall from power, he aligned himself with Napoleon I and was eventually released from prison. David had a huge number of pupils, making him the strongest influence in French art of the early 19th century. This is one of David's masterpieces that contained a cast of thousands, incredible planning, and flawless execution. This painting is the embodiment of neoclassical painting. This was a commissioned painting, and David was permitted to watch the event. He obtained the plans of Notre Dame, and participants in the coronation came to his studio to pose individually, though never Napoleon. David did manage to get a private sitting with the Empress Josephine and Napoleon's sister Caroline. For his background, David had the choir of Notre Dame act as his fill-in characters. The Pope came to sit for the painting and actually blessed David. Finally, Napoleon came to see the painting, stared at the canvas for an hour, and said, "David, I salute you." David had to redo several parts of the painting because of Napoleon's various whims. It measures a whopping 20 feet 4 inches by 32 feet 1 inch. Mythology was a rich source of subject matter for the neoclassicists. The story of Oedipus and the Sphinx depicted here is so convoluted and complicated it would be impossible to unravel it here in a few minutes. I read it and went, huh? This painting shows Ingres' command of human anatomy as well as the use of chiaroscuro, both of which the neoclassical painter had to work into their paintings. In spite of Ingres' best efforts to keep the Romantics out, the times changed and they gained a foothold at the door of the prestigious Academy and Salon. The public was thrilled with paintings like these that were all about emotion rather than the precise reason of the neoclassicists. Now you could paint trepidation, horror, terror, and awe. Mythology was abandoned for peasants, folklore, and untamed nature. The Raft of the Medusa is about the Medusa, a scandalous shipwreck of 1816, where the captain left 147 passengers and crew to die. They hastily assembled the raft as the mother ship was sinking, and while adrift the ill-fated survivors died one by one a horrible death, until only 15 were rescued. Géricault selected this well-known event that he knew would create controversy and bring him notoriety. He researched the story obsessively, even built a model of the raft, interviewed 2 of the survivors, and went to morgues and hospitals to see the flesh of the dead and dying. The painting was highly controversial at the 1819 Salon, as the public was fascinated and repelled, and in London the painting drew huge crowds, and Géricault earned both fame and fortune from the painting. Géricault's health was undermined by various excesses, and he died in 1824 at the age of 33. Turner is one of those artists who don't fit in their time quite right. His paintings appear to fall into 2 categories: quintessential romantic atmospheric scenes and wild, nearly abstract paintings of nature in all her fury. As he grew older, Turner became more eccentric. He had few close friends except for his father, who lived with him for 30 years, eventually working as his studio assistant. Even though he was English, his inclusion here had to do with his profound effect on the Impressionist painters, who were thrilled by his work. Turner's motive for painting this canvas may have been a desire to impress British critics and viewers with his ability to handle serious themes. However, it does appear that the young painter mistitled his picture, as this canvas actually depicts the 7th plague of Egypt, when Moses stretched his arms toward heaven, and thunder, hail, and fire rained on the Pharaoh and his people. The 5th plague of Egypt called for doom and disaster to befall on the livestock. Both of these painters influenced the Impressionists in one way or the other, either as a teacher or as a role model. It is interesting to note that they both died around the time of the first Impressionist show in 1874, and these 2 photographs were taken by Nadar, the photographer in whose studio that first show would be held. Courbet said this: "I am 50 years old, and I have always lived in freedom. Let me end my life free. When I am dead, let this be said of me: he belonged to no school, to no church, to no institution, to no academy, least of all to any regime except the regime of liberty." How is that for a romantic manifesto? Courbet painted some amazing works, some of which were scandalous, even verging on the pornographic. He got tangled into French politics and had to exile to Switzerland, where he continued to paint and drink himself to death. Here is a painting that could be mistaken for an Impressionist plein air work. The cliffs at Étretat were religiously painted by legions of painters, and it is clear that Courbet, near the end of his life here, was pushing the envelope toward what became known as Impressionism 4 years later. Corot's use of color and light echo what was to come from Monet and Pissarro only a few years later. Most of the Impressionists knew Corot, studied with him, or his paintings. Unlike many artists, he was apolitical and happy with his luck in life. Financially stable, he was generous to his poorer friends. He gave money to Millet's widow, bought a house for the blind and homeless Daumier, and supported a day center for children. He enjoyed great success and appreciation from artists, collectors, and critics. But many of his friends and supporters felt that he was officially neglected. So in 1874, they presented him with a gold medal shortly before his death. Painted the same year as Courbet's Cliffs at Étretat, this canvas clearly shows the coming trend in painting. The times were definitely changing. Both Delacroix and Boudin were classified as Romantic painters, but they both influenced the Impressionists, and Boudin became Monet's first teacher. Their later work is clear evidence that the Impressionist movement began before 1874 and was not somehow invented by Monet, which many people believe. A generation of Impressionists were inspired by Delacroix's work. Renoir and Manet made copies of his paintings, and Degas purchased the portrait of Baron Switzer for his private collection. Delacroix's use of expressive brushstrokes and his study of the optical effects of color profoundly shaped the work of the Impressionists, while his passion for the exotic inspired the artists of the Symbolist movement. Delacroix was seeking the exotic for themes, and he traveled to places like North Africa to get inspiration. He identified with Byron, who represented the lonely figure of man against nature. Baudelaire said this: Delacroix was passionately in love with passion, but coldly determined to express passion as clearly as possible. Eugene Boudin was one of the most influential artists to the Impressionists. He was born on the Channel coast of France and spent most of his artistic life painting the sea, harbors, and inlets of the Normandy and Brittany coast. I guess that this painting was an early example of his work due to the dark colors and distinct harking back to the work of Chardin, who did many still life paintings of dead fish and animals. This was one of Boudin's submissions to the first Impressionist show of 1874. Due to the portability of artist materials, he painted in plein air often, and the young Monet was said to have seen Boudin on the Normandy beaches as a young man. Painting outside was not a new idea. Many artists did sketches and watercolors outside, but to do finished paintings outside was quite a novel idea. Étretat is a small village on the Normandy coast about 20 miles from Le Havre. It has been painted by a host of famous and amateur artists. You will recall the many paintings of Étretat by Monet. I love the wildness of this painting and the luminous lighting effects of the sky. Painted in 1890, as Impressionism as a movement was beginning to fall apart, we can see that Eugene Boudin started as a Romantic painter and became a pre-impressionist, and toward the end was pushing the artistic envelope toward more abstract themes and ideas as the century was ending and a new era of painting was ushered in. If you were a young, aspiring artist in the mid-19th century, this is what you had to do to make it. You had to go to the École des Beaux-Arts and excel in your craft, submit paintings to the Salon and win medals, commissions, and prestige, where you would probably get bored and or angry at the academy and go to one of the independent art schools or study at the atelier of a master. And then you would spend the night in a Paris cafe drinking and arguing about art. The Académie des Beaux-Arts was founded in 1648 to educate the most talented students in drawing, painting, sculpture, engraving, and architecture. Louis XIV selected graduates from the school to decorate the royal apartments at Versailles. And in 1863, Napoleon III granted the school independence from the government, changing the name to l'École des Beaux-Arts. Women were admitted beginning in 1897. Here the traditions of classical art were taught, and students had to endlessly repeat boring and routine studies, first from engravings, then from casts, and finally from the nude model. Then they had to pass extremely difficult exams. By the middle of the 19th century, artists were not expected to be innovative and creative, but had to mirror the teacher's styles and ideas. There were no art dealers, galleries, or independent means of selling work or gaining commissions. The Salon began in 1674 to show the works of the graduates of the Académie des Beaux-Arts and to ensure a pool of artists who were capable of decorating royal palaces and to paint royal personages. By the middle of the 19th century, these shows were becoming extremely political, and an artist's career hinged on being accepted first and then getting a medal or royal commission. Eventually, a jury was appointed to select the works that were to be shown, but the only qualified jurors were members of the Salon themselves, and thus they gained a great deal of power to decide the fate of a poor student. Salon shows often had 4,000 to 6,000 paintings to process, accept, hang, and judge, and as this slide illustrates, were hung from floor to ceiling in a manner which has become known as salon-style hanging. After the French Revolution, the exhibition was open to foreign students and some non-academy students as well. The Salon was held in large commercial halls to which the ticket-bearing public was invited. Opening night was a grand social occasion called the Vernissage for special buyers and the top layers of Parisian society. Caricatures of the Salon appeared in abundance from the 1840s to about 1900. These Salon reviews in pictorial form poked fun at the yearly exhibition, from its dizzying display of thousands of paintings and sculptures, to the self-importance of viewers, to the prevailing mediocrity of the works. Much of the humor results from the clash between the Salon's growing irrelevance to contemporary life. The cover of Journal Amusant on the right illustrates this divide. A common target was the socially diverse public who attended the event. Honoré Daumier lampooned the public's various misreadings of art, their social pretensions and affections, and their view of art as entertaining spectacle. In the drawing to the left, Daumier depicts the mêlée on Sundays, the day of free admission. It is estimated that in 1863, France had about 5,000 critics and writers to cover the Salon shows, and Paris alone had about 12,000 working painters. This year, 4,000 paintings, many done by artists who had already garnered prizes and stature, were rejected by the Salon jury. The gauntlet was tossed and war declared. The furor was waged both in the press and in the cafes. The establishment of stodgy academicians had a stranglehold on art and artists, and they were determined to keep the upstarts in their places, out. Some of the avant-garde were Courbet, Manet, Millet, and Corot. The writer Zola, who was a great friend to the Impressionists, wrote a novel in 1886 about the Salon and a rejected masterpiece, causing a rift between him and Cézanne, his childhood friend. The furor was so intense that Napoleon III was pulled into the fray. He jumped on this art situation to try to assuage the liberals. So he went to the Salon and demanded that an annex of 7 rooms be designated as a Salon des Refusés. Evidently, 600 of the rejected painters were so outraged by one of Cézanne's paintings they refused to show their work even in the Salon des Refusés. But the Salon des Refusés was a huge success, and 7,000 visitors came to see the rejects and were horrified over the scandalous painting by Manet. They jeered, booed, and laughed at what they saw. Guards had to be posted to prevent the crowds from destroying Luncheon on the Grass and several paintings by Cézanne. As an aspiring student at the École des Beaux-Arts, you might have been bored to death with the routine of endless drawing before being allowed to paint, tormented by students who were jealous of your talents or simply fascinated by the new painters and ideas that were not being taught at the École. So you had a choice about moving on. There were independent schools as well as ateliers run by famous artists. Rudolf Julien established the Académie Julien in 1868 as a private studio school for art students, including women. Women participated in the same studies as men, including the basis of art training at the time, drawing and painting of nude models, which was considered improper for women. Eventually, Académie Julien students were granted the right to compete for the Prix de Rome at the Salon. The Académie Colarossi was chosen by many American artists who sought validation by studying art in Paris. Women were also accepted at this academy. The school closed sometime in the 1930s. It is said that Madame Colarossi burned the priceless school archives in retaliation for her husband's philandering. The Académie Suisse was founded by Charles Suisse, who is said to have been one of David's models. It started in a squalid room on the Quai des Orfèvres sometime between 1825 and 1830. Artists could go there and work from models for a small fee. There were no formal teachers or exams, but the Académie Suisse was important in that many artists from around the world came here to work from the models and meet each other. It was here that the core Impressionist group met each other. Some artists went to study with a master who ran an atelier. Monet went with Glare. This is a perfect example of the ideals espoused in classical painting. It is called Romans Under the Yoke. The theme is historical and noble. There's a cast of thousands set in a landscape. The chiaroscuro lighting effects highlights the figures that the artist considers important. Glare studied with one of David's students. One day, Glare looked at one of Monet's paintings and said, not bad at all, but you have a stocky man here. He has huge feet. You've painted them just as they are. That's all very ugly. Remember, young man, when one draws a figure, one must think of antiquity, Nature, my friend, is all very well as an object of study, but is of no interest in itself. Style, you see, is everything. Monet left for vacation and never came back. Cafes were an important part of Parisian life. They were important meeting places and sometimes functioned as centers of intellectual life. In the booming nightlife of the Paris cafes, art was argued, duels were proposed, and political intrigues were arranged. One can imagine the tipsy conversations of a rejected painter who sought comfort and companionship with their fellows and a glass of absinthe, which, if you don't know, was a particularly addictive drink which was supposed to have done major damage to the drinker's nervous system. Absinthe is available again after being banned in Europe and America for decades. It was probably in the cafes at night that the seeds of the first Impressionist exhibit were sown. Disgruntled and fed up with the salon and being hopelessly rejected by the establishment, Monet and his friends decided to find a place to have their own show. It was not to be a salon des refuses, but a legitimate art show. Felix Tournichon, otherwise known as Nadar, was a man about town, jack of all trades, a painter, journalist, caricaturist, balloonist, and pioneering photographer. His large studio was vacant, so he offered it to his artist friends, who had formed a cooperative group called Cooperative and Anonymous Association of Painters, Sculptors, and Engravers, in order to show their work independent of the salon. A group was formed, and it was to be a cooperative, with dues and duties assumed by all the members. Just like our art clubs of today, only a few dedicated members did all the work. One rule was that all the paintings had to be new and never accepted or rejected by the salon. Some of these artists are unknown today, but some have become household names. From April 15 to May 15, 1874, the group of 35 artists presented 163 works, ranging from a few fairly academic pieces to 3 little outrages by Paul Cézanne that guards feared might be ripped apart by the crowd. They might have been, except for the fact that there was no crowd. A few sympathetic critics praised the show. A few more clobbered it. Most of them ignored it. So did the public. The show was even open at night as an enticement for more people to come, but it amounted to a miserable flop. Meanwhile, across town at the salon, some 400,000 people paid 10 francs to see over 4,000 works. A total of 8 exhibitions were held between 1874 and 1886. Only Degas, Pissarro, and Morisot remained steadfast to the end. Subsequent shows were held in the gallery of the dealer Paul Durand-Ruel, who was responsible for selling enough of their work for them to survive at all. This was Monet's submission to the show. I've often wondered why this painting and not a host of others that I think are much better, but he must have had his reasons. Dated 1872, its subject is the harbor of Le Havre in France, using very loose brushstrokes that suggest rather than delineate it. Monet explained the title later. Landscape is nothing but an impression, and an instantaneous one, hence this label that was given us by the way of Because of Me. I had sent a thing done in Le Havre from my window, sun in the mist, and a few masts of boats sticking up in the foreground. They asked me for a title for the catalogue. It couldn't really be taken for a view of Le Havre, and I said, put impression. Critic Louis Leroy, inspired by the painting's name, titled his hostile review of the show in Le Charivari newspaper, The Exhibition of the Impressionists, thus inadvertently naming the new art movement. He wrote, quote, Impression, I was certain of it. I was just telling myself that since I was impressed, there had to be some impression in it. And what freedom, what ease of workmanship. Wallpaper in its embryonic state is more finished than that seascape. Other critics were equally outraged and wrote similar disparaging reviews of the show. The next few slides will illustrate what you have to do to be an Impressionist painter. This painting is Monet's Cliff at Etretat After the Storm, 1885. Short, thick strokes of paint are used to quickly capture the essence of the subject rather than its details. This is called broken brushwork. Colors are applied side by side with as little mixing as possible, creating a vibrant surface. The optical mixing of colors occurs in the eye of the viewer. Grays and dark tones are produced by mixing complementary colors. In pure Impressionism, the use of black paint is avoided. However, most of the painters put black back on their palettes in later years. Wet paint is placed into wet paint without waiting for successive applications to dry, producing softer edges and an intermingling of color. Paint in the late afternoon, evening, or early morning to get the atmospheric effects of the light during those times of the day. The 19th century was characterized by discovery and change. Inventions such as the internal combustion engine, photography, telegraphy, and the telephone, rocket science, were 19th century inventions. Huge changes in the discovery in medicine were changing lives. People had money, and the middle class had rights and privileges not known before. And it was easy to travel to far distant places by train and ship. People had leisure time, money to buy art and attend the theater and opera, read books, and visit the Parisian cafes at night. And all this had a huge impact on artist materials. The box on the left was a typical paint box containing powdered pigments which had to be ground by hand with oils to make paint. Pigment comes from various sources: clay, earths, plants, and from minerals and metals that are mined. Many of the minerals and metals had to be processed and refined with heat and pressure to form the pigments illustrated on the right. In 1841, when the very young Claude Monet had just celebrated his first birthday, the American artist John Rand patented the first metal tube for artist's oil paint. Before that happy invention, paint was stored in glass jars or animal bladders. Rand's drawing that was submitted for his patent is illustrated on the left, and the finished product is the tube of paint we're familiar with today. Renoir said years later, without paint in tubes, there would be no Impressionism. John Rand, who was an interesting character, eventually sold the rights to his invention in England, and the Winsor Newton Paint Company began marketing tube paint as we know it today. Color in the history of pigments and dyes is a huge and fascinating topic of its own. The 19th century was a time when color in carpets, clothes, and wall paints were being discovered to satisfy the growing middle class's ability to pay for unique colors in dresses and fabrics. A fallout of all this labor was the discovery of these artist colors, which transformed works from dingy dark paintings to the bright colors of the Impressionists. As the century wore on, artists and paint manufacturers learned what additives would destroy their paintings, and the science of conservation began, and simple rules like fat over lean were taught in the schools. The artist's palette tells a great deal about their method of painting. A closed or controlled palette was based on the artist arranging colors in value strings Typically, their palette would be mostly grays and browns with few colors, as this example of Delacroix's palette. This is called an open palette, where colors are not pre-mixed, but placed in some order known only to the artist in most cases. Degas is using very traditional colors plus black. This is a little messy for my taste, but it shows puddles of paints that were probably mixed spontaneously on the palette or on the canvas itself. This is an open palette where colors and values are mixed on the canvas and notable for the intense colors and few darks. I wonder what I would say about this palette if Monet were my student. This is an open palette of warm and cool primary colors from light to dark, which includes several blacks. I enjoy experimenting with unusual colors, and so they are placed in a separate section of the palette shown here under the ends of the brushes. Here's where I place my magenta, purples, and offbeat colors like quinacridones and Mars colors. These are the men and women who are considered by art historians and the Impressionists themselves to be true Impressionist painters. There were others, but these are the artists who were invited to show in the Impressionist exhibitions. They knew each other, studied together, painted together, sometimes lived together, and showed their work together. Sometimes they supported each other when they were down and out and had violent disagreements as to who should be called an Impressionist. Frédéric Bazille was born in Montpellier in the south of France into a wealthy Protestant family. He became interested in painting after seeing some works of Eugene Delacroix. His family agreed to let him study painting, but only if he studied medicine. He began studying medicine in 1859 and moved to Paris in 1862 to continue his studies. There he met Renoir and Sisley and was drawn to Impressionist painting and began taking classes in Charles Glaire's studio. After failing his medical exam in 1864, he began painting full-time. Generous with his wealth, he helped support his less fortunate associates by giving them space in his studio and materials to use. He was just 23 years old when he painted several of his best-known works. He joined a Zouave regiment in August 1870, a month after the outbreak of the Franco-Prussian War, and died on the battlefield at the age of 29 on November 28, 1870. Here is my favorite Impressionist painter. Caillebotte earned a law degree. He was also an engineer. He was drafted to fight in the Franco-Prussian War. But after the war, he began to seriously study painting. He inherited his father's fortune in 1874, and the three sons divided the family fortune after their mother's death in 1878. He moved to a small town near Argenteuil in 1888. He spent a lot of his time gardening and building racing yachts and quit showing his work and painted smaller and smaller canvases. Renoir was a friend and frequent visitor. He died at the age of 45 in 1894. Leaving an amazing art collection of his own work and his Impressionist friends. Caillebotte did make his debut in the second Impressionist exhibition in 1876, showing 8 paintings, including Floor Scrapers, his earliest masterpiece. Its subject matter, the depiction of laborers preparing a wooden floor, was considered vulgar by some critics, and is the probable reason why it was rejected by the Salon of 1875. Renoir was the executor of his will, in which he donated his collection to the French government. Knowing that these paintings would likely be shoved in the cellar, Caillebotte stipulated that these works of art should be displayed at the Luxembourg Palace and then in the Louvre. The French government would not agree to these terms. in February of 1896, they finally negotiated terms with Renoir, under which they took 38 of the paintings to the Luxembourg. The installation constituted the first presentation of the Impressionists in a public venue in France. The remaining 29 paintings were offered to the French government twice more, in 1904 and in 1908, and both times were refused. When the government finally attempted to claim them in 1928, the bequest was repudiated by the widow of Caillebot's son. Most of the remaining works were purchased by Albert C. Barnes and are now held by the Barnes Foundation, which has also been the subject of a pitched battle in the courts for years, and only now has been somewhat resolved with a planned move to Center City, Philadelphia, into a newly built exhibition hall that is going to be accessible to the art-loving public. While plans are underway for this historic move, the legal battle is still being fought in the courts as appeals and new suits are still ongoing. Caillebot is still an unknown to the vast majority of the public and only now is gaining acceptance as a marvelous painter in his own right. A major show of his work was presented last year by the Brooklyn Museum. Mary Cassatt was a fiercely determined woman from a young age to pursue her love of painting over the objections of her family. Starting at the Pennsylvania Academy of Fine Arts, she eventually wound up in Paris, and through a succession of classes, master ateliers, and associations, she was invited by Degas to be in the first Impressionist show. Diagnosed with diabetes, rheumatism, neuralgia, and cataracts in 1911, she did not slow down, but after 1914 she was forced to stop painting as she became almost blind. Nonetheless, she took up the cause of women's suffrage, and in 1915 she showed 18 works in an exhibition supporting the movement. She died on June 14, 1926, near Paris, and is buried in a cemetery in France. Her life story is fascinating, and her prodigious work has been loved by all who view it. Working in many mediums, including printmaking, Cassatt is one of the two original female Impressionist painters. From 1859 to 1861, complying with his father's wishes, Cézanne attended the law school of the University of Aix, while also receiving drawing lessons. Going against the objections of his banker father, he committed himself to pursuing his artistic development and left Aix for Paris in 1861. He was strongly encouraged to make this decision by Zola, his childhood friend, who was already living in the capital at the time. Eventually, his father reconciled with Cézanne and supported his choice of career. Cézanne later received an inheritance that allowed him to paint without financial worry. Cézanne's paintings were shown in the first exhibition of the Salon des Refuses in 1863. The Salon rejected Cézanne's submissions every year from 1864 to 1869. He finally got in 1882, thanks to another Impressionist artist friend who was able to pull strings. Although religious images appeared less frequently in Cézanne's later work, he remained a devout Roman Catholic and said, "When I judge art, I take my painting and put it next to a God-made object, like a tree or flower. If it clashes, it is not art." Cézanne was a loner and not particularly well liked by the sophisticated Paris painters. They considered him a hick from the country and were unsure of what his work was about. He exhibited twice with the Impressionists, in 1874 and 1877. Cézanne's explorations of geometric simplification and optical phenomena inspired Picasso, Braque, and Gris, and the next generation of artists and others to experiment with ever more complex, multiple views of the same subject, and eventually to the fracturing of form. Cezanne thus sparked one of the most revolutionary areas of artistic inquiry of the 20th century, one which was to affect profoundly the development of modern art. Degas' ambition was to be a history painter, a calling for which he was well prepared by his rigorous academic training and close study of classic art. In his early 30s, he changed course, and by bringing the traditional methods of a history painter to bear on contemporary subject matter, he became a classical painter of modern life. Degas was one of those artists who did not fit with his times, much like Turner. He abhorred the scandal created by the exhibitions, as well as the publicity and advertising that his colleagues sought, and he bitterly rejected the label Impressionist that the press had created and popularized. But his insistence on including non-Impressionist artists such as Forain and Raffaelli in their exhibitions created rancor within the group, contributing to their eventual disbanding in 1886. As his financial situation improved, he was able to indulge his passion for collecting works by artists he admired, old masters such as El Greco, and such contemporaries as Manet, Pissarro, Cezanne, Gauguin, and Van Gogh. Three artists he idolized, Ingres, Delacroix, and Daumier, were especially well represented in his collection. He considered making his own museum, but the collection was auctioned off in 1918, the year after his death. In the late 1880s, Degas also developed a passion for photography. Degas excelled in everything he tried, painting in pastel and oil, sculpture, and printmaking. Many of Degas' pastels are actually monotypes which are overworked with pastel. As the years passed, Degas became isolated, due in part to his belief that a painter could have no personal life. The Dreyfus controversy brought his anti-Semitic leanings to the fore, and he broke with all his Jewish friends. His argumentative nature was deplored by Renoir, who said of him, "What a creature he was, that Degas! All his friends had to leave him. I was one of the last to go, but even I couldn't stay till the end." Although he is known to have been working in pastel as late as the end of 1907, and is believed to have continued making sculpture as late as 1910, he apparently ceased working in 1912, and when the impending demolition of his longtime residence forced a wrenching move to new quarters, he never married and spent the last years of his life nearly blind, restlessly wandering the streets of Paris before dying in 1917. Guillaumin is another Impressionist artist who is not very well known. He worked at his uncle's lingerie shop while attending evening drawing lessons. He also worked for a French government railway before studying at the Académie Suisse. In 1861, where he met Cezanne and Pissarro, who became lifelong friends. While he never achieved the stature of these two, his influence on their work was significant. Cezanne attempted his first etching, based on Guillaumin's paintings of barges on the River Seine. Guillaumin exhibited at the Salon des Refusés in 1863 and later became a friend of Vincent van Gogh, whose brother Theo sold some of his works. When I was in art school in the 60s, I remember walking up Madison Avenue and spotting a painting in a gallery window nearly a block away. It was clearly an Impressionist painting, but I'd never heard of the artist, so I went into the gallery to find out more. The snooty dealer deigned to talk to me primarily because he had no customers. There were other paintings by Guillaume in this gallery that were amazing for their color and vibrancy. Although this is not that painting in the window, I always remember Guillaume like a long-lost friend when I see one of his paintings. With paintings like these, it's a shame Guillaume didn't achieve more recognition for his work. There's very little information about him, and his association with the Impressionists was somewhat tentative, as some of them thought he was an inferior painter. Why they thought that is certainly a mystery. Art historians want Manet to be an Impressionist, but he did not want to be that closely identified with the group, although he was befriended by all of them, and influences went both ways. Unlike the core Impressionist group, Manet maintained that modern artists should seek to exhibit at the Paris Salon rather than abandon it in favor of independent exhibitions. Nevertheless, when Manet was excluded from the International Exhibition of 1867, he set up his own exhibition. His mother worried that he would waste all his inheritance on this project, which was enormously expensive. While the exhibition earned poor reviews from the major critics, it also provided his first contact with several future Impressionist painters, including Degas. Berthe Morisot became a friend, and eventually she married Manet's brother Eugene. Some of Manet's paintings scandalized polite society, and he was repeatedly rejected by the Salon. But he continued to seek Salon approval until the end. He never did show with the Impressionists. He continued to paint subjects that ranged from portraits to social commentary to cafe scenes and some plein-air landscapes, as well as still lifes such as this. Manet died of untreated syphilis and rheumatism, which he contracted in his 40s. The disease caused him considerable pain and partial paralysis from locomotor ataxia in the years prior to his death. His left foot was amputated because of gangrene. 11 days later, he died at the age of 51 in Paris. It would be impossible to give in a few minutes a synopsis of Monet, who remains to this day one of the most known and loved artists of all time. Although born in Paris, his family moved to Le Havre, and here he met Boudin, who was painting on the beaches of the Normandy coast. Boudin became his mentor and taught him to paint. He went to Paris and started to take art lessons with Gleyre, and here he met Basile, Sisley, and Renoir. Devoted to his wife Camille, they eventually had 2 children before she tragically died of tuberculosis at age 32. Moving from one town to another, Monet eventually ended up in the small town of Giverny, about 50 miles west of Paris, on the banks of the River Seine, where he settled down to paint for the rest of his life. After living in total poverty and often being rescued from financial ruin by his other Impressionist friends, Monet finally began to have his work sold by Paul Durand-Ruel and saw some financial success. An avid traveler, Monet painted wherever he went, and his paintings of the Thames and Houses of Parliament are among his finest. In 1923, he underwent 2 operations to remove cataracts. The paintings done while the cataracts affected his vision have a general reddish tone, which is characteristic of the vision of cataract victims. It may also be that after surgery he was able to see certain ultraviolet wavelengths of light that are normally excluded by the lens of the eye. This may have had an effect on the colors he perceived. After his operations, he even repainted some of these paintings with bluer patches, as in the water lilies, than before the operation. Monet lived well into the 20th century and died of lung cancer on 5 December 1926 at the age of 86. He is buried in the Giverny Church Cemetery. His famous home, garden, and water lily pond were restored and opened for visitors in 1980, and it attracts visitors and painters from all over the world. Berthe Morisot was born in Bourges, France, into a successful bourgeois family. Both she and her sister chose to become painters, but later her sister gave up painting to have a family. According to family tradition, one of her ancestors was Fragonard, who was an influential painter of the Rococo era. By age 20, she had met and befriended the important and pivotal painter Corot, who instructed Berthe and her sister in painting and introduced them to other artists and teachers. Under Corot's influence, Morisot took up the plein air method of working. Morisot's personal and artistic life is intertwined with Edward Manet, who became her mentor, friend, and painting companion on plein air excursions. Berthe married Eugene Manet and became sister-in-law to the famous artist, who encouraged her to show with the Impressionists, even though he remained outside the group. Her paintings reflect the 19th century cultural restrictions of her class and gender. She avoided urban and street scenes as well as the nude figure, and like her fellow female impressionist Mary Cassatt, focused on domestic life and portraits in which she could use family and personal friends as models. Paintings like The Cradle, 1872, in which she depicted current trends for nursery furniture, reflect her sensitivity to fashion and advertising, both of which would have been apparent to her female audience. Her works include landscapes, portraits, garden settings, and boating scenes, family and domestic life. Morisot was one of the 3 painters who showed in all 8 of the Impressionist shows. Pizarro was born at Charlotte Amalie, St. Thomas, Virgin Islands, to Abraham Gabriel Pizarro, a Portuguese Sephardic Jew, and Rachel Manzano Pommier from the Dominican Republic. Pizarro lived in St. Thomas until age 12, when he went to a boarding school in Paris. After traveling in South America, he went back to Paris, where he studied at various academic institutions, including the École des Beaux-Arts and the Académie Suisse, and under a succession of masters, Corot, Courbet, and Daubigny, another artist who had great influence on successive generations of painters. Pizarro's influence on his fellow Impressionists is probably still underestimated. Not only did he offer substantial contributions to Impressionist theory, but he also managed to remain on friendly, mutually respectful terms with such difficult personalities as Edgar Degas, Cézanne, and Gauguin. Pizarro exhibited at all 8 of the Impressionist exhibitions. Moreover, whereas Monet was the most prolific and emblematic practitioner of the Impressionist style, Pizarro was nonetheless a primary developer of Impressionist technique. Pizarro experimented with neo-Impressionist ideas between 1885 and 1890, discontented with what he referred to as Romantic Impressionism. He investigated pointillism, which he called scientific Impressionism, before returning to a purer Impressionism in the last decade of his life. Pizarro married Julie Vallée, a maid in his mother's household. Their offspring were all involved with art in some form. Lucien, the oldest son, became a follower of William Morris. Camille's great-grandson, Joaquim Pizarro, was the former head of curator of drawing and painting at the Museum of Modern Art in New York City and is now a professor in Hunter College's art department. Others of his progeny are painters who have also achieved reputations on their own merits. Renoir was born in Limoges, the child of a working-class family. As a boy, he worked in a porcelain factory where his drawing talents led to him being chosen to paint designs on fine china. During those early years, he often visited the Louvre to study the French master painters. In 1862, he began studying art under Charles Gleyre in Paris, where he met Sisley, Basile, and Monet. Although Renoir first started exhibiting paintings at the Paris Salon in 1864, recognition did not come for another 10 years, due in part to the turmoil of the Franco-Prussian War. Renoir and Monet worked closely together during the late 1860s, painting similar scenes of popular river resorts and views of a bustling Paris. Renoir was by nature more solid than Monet, and while Monet fixed his attentions on the ever-changing patterns of nature, Renoir was interested in people and often painted friends and associates in Parisian settings. Around 1892, Renoir developed rheumatoid arthritis. In 1907, he moved to the warmer climate close to the Mediterranean coast. Renoir painted during the last 20 years of his life, even when arthritis severely limited his movement and he was wheelchair-bound. He developed progressive deformities in his hands and ankylosing of his right shoulder, requiring him to adapt his painting technique. It has often been reported that in the advanced stages of his arthritis, he painted by having a brush strapped to his paralyzed fingers, but this is erroneous. Renoir remained able to grasp a brush, although he required an assistant to place it in his hand. The wrapping of his hands with bandages apparent in late photographs of the artist served to prevent skin irritations. Alfred Sisley was born and spent most of his life in France. He generally is recognized as the most consistent of the Impressionists in his dedication to painting landscape en plein air. He didn't venture into figure painting, portraiture, or genre scenes, and found that pure Impressionism as a landscape painter was all he wanted to do. Sisley was born in Paris to affluent English parents. At the age of 18, Sisley was sent to London to study for a career in business, but he abandoned it after 4 years and returned to Paris in 1861 to study at the Atelier of Gleyre, where he became acquainted with Basile, Monet, and Renoir. Together they would paint landscapes en plein air. During the 1860s, Sisley was in a better position than some of his fellow artists, for he received an allowance from his father, who was a silk merchant. In 1868, he had some paintings accepted by the Salon, but he received no financial or critical success from this. The war ruined his father's business, so the painter's sole means of support became the sale of his works. For the remainder of his life, he would live in poverty. Occasionally, however, Sisley would be backed up by his patrons. This allowed him, among other things, to make a few brief trips to England. The first of these occurred around 1874, after the first independent Impressionist exhibition. The result of a few months spent near London was a series of nearly 20 paintings of the Upper Thames near Moseley, which was later described by art historian Kenneth Clark as, quote, a perfect moment of Impressionism. He died in France in 1899, only a few months after the death of his wife. This painting, called The Lane of Poplars at Moret, has been stolen 3 times from the Musée des Beaux-Arts in Nice. The first time was in 1978 when it was on loan in Marseille. It was recovered a few days later in the city's sewers. The second time was in 1998, and this time the museum's curator was convicted of the theft and jailed for 5 years along with 2 accomplices. Finally, the third time was in August of 2007. 10 months later, the French National Police recovered it and 3 other stolen paintings from inside a van in Marseille. The core group of Impressionist painters, if they lived long enough, continue to explore new ideas and theories, abandoning the pure Impressionist theories for abstraction, pointillism, and fractured form. Painters such as Lautrec, Van Gogh, Seurat, and Gauguin had their roots in Impressionism, but they branched out into other areas and became known as the Post-Impressionists, and their later works were clearly indicative of what was to come as the century ended and artists were inspired to become self-expressive and creative, thanks to the revolt of the Impressionists against the Salon and the Academy. Artists from all over the world flocked to Paris to learn from the masters, and the story of Impressionism in America is another wonderful story of invention, creativity, and revolution.